man known as the Butcher of Bosnia, Ratko Mladic, at first appeared relaxed on what would become a historic day. But after an outburst...
Mr. Mladic, if you continue like this...
He was ordered to leave and wasn't present to hear the verdict. He was found guilty at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia of 10 counts, including genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes.
For having committed these crimes, the Chamber sentences Mr. Ratko Mladic to life imprisonment.
These women have waited for more than 20 years for justice for their relatives. The tribunal found the Bosnian Serb army commander significantly contributed to the genocide in Srebrenica. Still, many Serbs see him as a war hero, but this verdict will forever define his role in history as a perpetrator of what the court calls some of the most heinous crimes known to humankind. This is footage from one day in the Balkan War. It was shot on August 28, 1995. 2 shells hit the center of Sarajevo in the morning. More than 30 people were killed and at least 60 others were wounded. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was set up to deal with the atrocities committed during the conflict in the 1990s.
A case of a violation of the laws or customs of war.
It was the first war crimes court created by the UN. Its decisions have set precedents on genocide, crimes against humanity, and recognizing sexual violence as a war crime. It has also given the world an extensively documented history of the war. More than 4,500 witnesses have testified, and 2.5 million pages of transcripts have been generated. The tribunal has indicted 161 individuals. The former president of Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, was brought to The Hague, but died during his trial. Former Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic was convicted of several crimes, including genocide, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. The court has come under criticism from some Serbs, though. They argue prosecutors have mostly targeted Serbian suspects and not Croats and Bosnian Muslims. The tribunal was supposed to help with reconciliation in the former Yugoslavia, but even its chief prosecutor acknowledges the difficulties in achieving that.
As long as you have in Bosnia 3 different history books used by the Serbian Croatian or Bosnian community with a totally different assessment about not only the wars but the last 200 years, well, if the society cannot agree on a joint history, how do you want to move forward?
The tribunal closes in December, but what will be its legacy after seeking justice for victims for more than 20 years? Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Nerma Jelagic. She's the former spokeswoman for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In Belgrade, we have Darko Trifunovic. He's a former advisor to the State Secretary for War Crimes of Bosnia and Herzegovina and a former First Secretary of the Foreign Service at the UN. And at The Hague, we have Nevenka Tromp. She's the author of Prosecuting Slobodan Milosevic, The Unfinished Trial. She's also a lecturer on Eastern European Studies at the University of Amsterdam. I thank you all for joining us. Nevenka Tromp, let me begin with you. Has justice been served?
Yes, the justice has been served, but with the explanation that the legal justice is nothing else than determination by the judges if individual has found guilty of the charges as charged in the indictment. And this is something that outside world and non-lawyers very often fail to understand. And this sort of justice as produced by these sort of international criminal tribunals will be always limited because the starting point of justice system is always what is being charged in the indictment.
Right. Nerma, are you happy by this announcement, guilty of genocide, guilty on all counts barring one. Is it something you've been through the process? It's been a painstaking process. Does this verdict give you joy?
It's a good judgment. Genocide, crimes against humanity, including extermination, persecution, murders. It has taken a long time, but the final conclusions of the trial chamber here are not surprising in any case for anyone, legal mind or non-legal mind, who has been following this trial. In a way, a lot of things that have been found in prior judgments and prior cases in front of the tribunal have been confirmed here in the Mladic judgment, and of course with the added value that his own individual criminal responsibility has been ascertained now beyond reasonable doubt. He got life sentence. It's unfortunate that he didn't stay in the courtroom to hear it live, so to speak, but he got his comeuppance. It took 20 years, but the final message today is justice is possible. It might take time, but it is possible.
Darko, the other two guests believe that justice is possible. You can't say that the ICTY wasn't thorough. They heard from 591 witnesses and examined nearly 10,000 exhibits concerning 106 separate crimes. With all of that in mind, do you accept that this has been a just decision?
Well, first of all, I don't know which kind of justice is served. We have taken in mind that Haramush Haranidaj was released. Ante Gotovina, he was sentenced as Ratko Mladic in the first trial, in the first, let's say, sentence. He was accused and then he was released later on. There was no sentence against Milošević, no sentence against Franjo Tuđman, no sentence against Alija Izetbegović. So we have no sentence against main player in this bloody civil war in Bosnia. I coming from the family of the victims. My family was the one of the first victim in Bosnia in the village of Sjekovac when my aunt was raped and no justice up to date. 200 Roma kids were slaughtered and we find out 56 bodies up to date, and Hague Tribunal doesn't want to pick up the case because it's a Roma case.
So Darko,
the obtaining justice is very problematic to me.
Okay, so you might have a case that other people have committed atrocities and you feel they haven't been adequately dealt with, right? You mentioned victims of your family, and nobody's diminishing the pain of Serbs and others. But why can't you say that and at the same time accept that there's overwhelming evidence that this man was responsible for the killing of 8,000 men and boys in Srebrenica, for the siege of Sarajevo in which more than 10,000 Sarajevans were killed? Why can't you say, well, while I feel there's been unfairness elsewhere, the evidence is clear that Ratko Mladic did unspeakable things in the name of the Bosnian Serbs during the Balkans War? Why does it have to be one or the other?
Because of the American prosecutor, he introduced this, let's say, using a RICO statute for criminal organization and labeling through Ratko Mladic case all Serbian people, not only in Bosnia. So that's why this is a very sad day. I feel very sympathy for all family of the victims because I feel sympathy to Muslims and Croatians that they lose their beloved ones. But also I lost mine and there is no justice. So I need to repeat you, this kind of the evidence presented by trial does not directly point it out to Ratko Mladic as an individual. And International Criminal Tribunal work with individual responsibility. So they create this kind of collective responsibility using a RICO statute. And this is illegal now. It's a matter for a legal, let's say, legal thinkings, etc., for our colleague lawyers. But the thing is now we have one side in Bosnia. We have pictures that only Bosnian Serbs commit atrocities. And we have a case of Izetbegović, who was a son in concentration camp.
You believe justice has been unfair here.
That they were raped there.
Okay, Nerma, you're shaking your head in disagreement. Tell me why.
Well, I shake my head in disagreement with a number of assertions of your guest from Belgrade. Of course, the issue of or the accusation of this judgment convicting a whole nation is absolutely incorrect. As you could have heard, Chief Prosecutor Bramertz, after this judgment, he of course knew that there would be voices who would be claiming that, as these voices have been saying that for the last 20 years that the tribunal is convicting nations and the whole people, and this is not true. The only person at the end of the day who stays in the jail is Ratko Mladic. The issue of what Darko Trifunovic calls RICO statute is the issue of joint criminal enterprise, which is not in any way a shocking application of the law. It was applied in the tribunal. It is being applied under different name and under different modalities in other international courts. But of course, this is not a judgment against the Serbian people. This is judgment against one man, the leader of the Bosnian Serb military, and the role and the power that he held over those structures that wreaked havoc and committed the crimes across the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina for 3.5 years. Granted, there are other crimes committed, of course, by all sides in the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular. And not everyone has been charged, not everyone has been convicted for that matter, but that doesn't mean that the buck stops with the tribunal. This is an international court that indicted 161 people. This is unheard of. But this work does not stop in The Hague. It does not stop with this judgment. The work continues in the Belgrade court, in Sarajevo court, and elsewhere. And all of us whose families suffered, which crimes were not part of the Mladic indictment or any other indictment for that matter, could indeed continue working for that justice and demanding this justice be done and continues to be done in front of the national courts.
Nevenka, Nerma said that this work does not stop at The Hague. Let's sort of take a broad view of international justice, because the whole concept of modern international justice was sort of spawned by the Balkans War, 22 years on from the end of the war, and given that at the end of the year we're seeing the ICTY wind up, there's been a lot of criticism regarding the ICTY. As we heard from Darko, there's been a lot of criticism of the sister court, the ICC, in the past few years. Let me ask you a broad question, Nevenka. Has this experiment in international justice worked or failed?
There is not one simple answer to that. I think it was a very noble endeavor, and I think it was absolutely needed and worthy of trying. It was an unfortunate situation. There was hardly any reference point for tribunal and Rwanda tribunal that were founded shortly after the ICTY, Yugoslavia tribunal. So many of these practices, as we see it now, were done almost learning by doing it. And of course, there were some shortcomings, some serious shortcomings, but there were also very important achievements. But what we now see, that it would be interesting to see whether all these best practices that tribunal has achieved, Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals, can be safely transformed to the permanent international criminal justice, criminal court here in The Hague. And there are serious doubts where this permanent court actually will have a long life. But to explain what I exactly mean by that, I would like to go back to the discussion that was started by Mr. Trifunovic, and to refer to the fact that this notion that Yugoslavia tribunal does so-called prosecute and try individuals, but basically seeking to reflect it as a collective responsibility or criminality of a people, and in his case, as he explained it, to Serbian people, is interesting, but because in the debate I've been following as someone who worked at the tribunal now from a scholarly point of view, this notion has been introduced in discussion by Serbs themselves. Do not forget that when Milosevic came to The Hague and opened his own case, he said, I'm not his individual, my whole people is on the trial. There was an interesting notion that Serbs always insist on collective responsibility, and we who work for tribunal, who observe it now, we know that this tribunal can go only so far to determine, even not innocence of someone, but to determine if someone has been found guilty as charged on the indictment. And to connect again this point with something Mr. Trifunovic said, that Ramush Haradinaj has been acquitted, General Gotovina has been acquitted. He, of course, omitted to mention that General Momčilo Perišić has been acquitted. But in a Serb interpretation of justice, whatever and whoever is acquitted who comes from Serbia, they find that it is justice. And if someone is acquitted that belongs to other nationality, or the other army or political corpus, Serbs would say it is injustice.
Okay, so let's ask Darko about that.
Cherry-picking by Serbian side.
Good point. Okay, so Darko, let me ask you, how come when your guys are acquitted, okay, the judges are fine and the court is fair, but when it's Croats or Bosniaks, suddenly the court is unfair? At the heart of it, isn't it true that many Bosnian Serbs and many people within Serbia itself have just failed to reconcile with the crimes that were committed more than 2 decades ago in their name? They're not responsible for it, but they're failing to recognize that bad things were done by people claiming to represent them.
Of course, we have many issues now. This is a good debate, but you need to have in mind, I was the Serb representative during the Rome Conference 1998 when International Criminal Court were established. So ICTY and ICTR practice was almost refused. Rule of procedure, statutes, everything is not incorporated in the ICC. Why? Something is wrong. So we cannot talk like this. So if some of Serbs like Momčilo Perišić, who was a minor relating to Gotovina and Ramush Haradinaj, is released, and there was not his engagement like in Gotovina case. I will give you just, I prepared indictment for Gotovina, and he was not even prosecuted for the crime in Mrkonjić Grad, and colleague from ICTY know what I'm talking about. So there is still open wounds, and there is still picture that ICTY is a completely political bodies, and that best practice of ICTY and ICTR was not accepted by international criminal law, actually is not accepted by International Criminal Court, which was established in 1998 in Rome.
Nerma, given that Mladic was the biggest fish among many, and this trial in a way sort of puts a button on going after all these major generals and commanders in the Bosnian War, we've seen pictures over the past 24 hours of mothers, of wives, of sisters, of children, of people who were killed in Srebrenica and elsewhere. Is this conviction going to provide closure for those people?
Well, that's always a difficult question. I think for a long time, for over 2 decades, by which I don't mean only people from Bosnia and former Yugoslavia, but in general, proponents of international criminal justice believed that the impact of these judgments could be much bigger outside of the courtroom than the reality shows us is the case. I believe today's judgment is a just judgment insofar as it correctly applied the law to the evidence that has been presented. Will that be enough for the victims is a question for each victim individually. From what I have seen from the statements so far, most of the victims who were there in The Hague and those watching back at their homes in Bosnia were satisfied with what they could hear, but they said this, of course, does not bring back our dead. So the question then is, how much can criminal justice, how much can these trials by themselves and alone contribute to a reconciliation of the people?
It's a massive day for the entire region. Ratko Mladic convicted. The judge, Alphonse Ori, saying Mladic's crimes rank among the most heinous known to humankind and include genocide and extermination. Unfortunately, I've got to move on. So Nevenka Tromp, Darko Trifunovic and Nerma Yelajic, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Bye-bye.